The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Band. Genesis. Album. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Songs on an album. Side 1, Song First. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Side 1, Song Second. Fly on a Windshield. Side 1, Song Third. Broadway Melody of 1974. Side 1, Song Fourth. Cuckoo, Cocoon. Side 1, Song Fifth. In the Cage. Side 1, Song Sixth. The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging. Side 2, Song First. Back in New York City. Side 2, Song Second. Hairless Heart. Side 2, Song Third. Counting Out Time. Side 2, Song Fourth. Carpet Crawlers. Side 2, Song Fifth. The Chamber of 32 Doors. Side 3, Song First. Lily White Lilith. Side 3, Song Second. The Waiting Room. Side 3, Song Third. Anyway. Side 3, Song Fourth. Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthetist. Side 3, Song Fifth. The Lamia. Side 3, Song Sixth. Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats. Side 4, Song First. The Colony of Slipperman. A. Rival. B. A Visit to the Doctor. C. Raven. Side 4, Song Second. Ravine. Side 4, Song Third. The Light Dies Down on Broadway. Side 4, Song Fourth. Riding the Scree. Side 4, Song Fifth. In the Rapids. Side 4, Song Sixth. It. Release date. The 22nd of November 1974. Label. Charisma. Recorded in Wales with the Island Mobile Studio, August-October 1974. Mixed at Island Studios, London, August-October 1974. Engineer. David Hutchins. Producers. John Burns and Genesis. Artwork and photography. Hypnosis. The band lineup. Michael Rutherford. Bass, 12-string guitar. Phil Collins. Percussion, vibing and voicing. Steve Hackett. Guitars. Tony Banks. Keyboards. Peter Gabriel. Voices and flute. Brian Eno. Enossification.
The making of the album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Having finally achieved some success in both the charts and on the road, packing venues wherever they went, and not just in Italy, Genesis were getting ready to enter a new and exciting phase in their artistic career. The band had spent the previous 4 years constantly touring, rehearsing, and recording, and, now that they had finally managed to get above outsider status, they were also aware of the fact that their increasingly large audience had ever higher expectations of them. However, the long and triumphant Selling England by the Pound tour caused devastating effects from a psychological point of view. With Gabriel now being idolized way beyond his expectations, the other 4 musicians were starting to feel the need to make music with different people, so while Mike continued to work with his old friend Ant Phillips, The Geese and the Ghost, the album they made together, which would be released 3 years later under the sole name of Anthony Phillips, is one of the most underrated prog treasures of all time. Phil Collins joined a pub band called Zix and the Radar Boys, with the intention of performing music in a looser, less structured style than Genesis. Alongside these extracurricular activities, and now under the prestigious management of Tony Smith, Genesis began thinking about their artistic future, how to follow up a masterpiece like Selling England by the Pound. Banks, when we started writing, we thought it would be adventurous and quite nice to try and do a double album concept. We had no idea what the concept was going to be or anything, but we felt that our audience would be able to take it. Peter seemed quite keen to do all the lyrics, which was something that had never been done before. Prior to this they had been very much split throughout the group, so we weren't really in favor of this. We felt it would give the album a bit of a one-dimensional quality and, for me, lyrically speaking, that is what happened. What's more, the relationships in the group weren't quite as easy as they had once been, probably because Peter was being thrust out as the star. You know, the media would only concentrate on Peter really, which was kind of strange in a group that was as democratic as we were. The band seemed really enthusiastic about the idea of making a concept album, an ambitious experiment already undertaken by numerous other bands from diverse genres, such as The Who with Tommy, Pretty Things with S.F. Sorrow and the Kinks' Arthur, or The Decline and Fall of the British Empire. Although Mike Rutherford's proposal to base it on the children's book The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was also taken into consideration during the very early stages of the project, in the end the band opted for what was then still a very vague storyline, put forward by the lead singer, about a half Puerto Rican immigrant called Rael who was living on the margins of society in New York. Gabriel, when we were about a fifth of the way into the process, I started to write some of the lyrics and I thought, yeah, there's a way of linking all this up and getting a sort of singular thread. A lot of people don't follow the thread very much but, in my head, it made a lot of sense. From the time of Supper's Ready I'd always wanted to try a bigger piece. We had a lot of discussions about the album and the writing of the story because I maintained then, and still do, that not many stories are written by committee. I was dreading fighting over things, the characters that I wanted to introduce, the words they would say or things someone else might want to include but that I didn't feel were appropriate. Collins, I have no idea why Peter chose Broadway. I do remember us being part of Macy's parade on Broadway, it must have been in 1972 and 1973, maybe it was during the Lamb period. We were all in white and we kind of jumped into the parade next to the white Michelin Man or something, maybe that's why. Or maybe it was just because we'd been to America a couple of times and there was a fascination with the size of the place, the steam in the streets coming up through the grills fascinated everybody. It was like, what goes on underneath there? What is it? The center of the earth. Rutherford, you need to ask Pete about the concept. It almost doesn't matter sometimes, because you just get on this journey and it takes you along. People hear songs, lyrically, the way they interpret them. I don't think they can actually hear the lyrics and I'm sure they don't understand them, apart from the choruses maybe. But they sound great anyway, lovely phrases. Hackett, it's a weird album, isn't it? A modern The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tale of redemption. It was Pete's concept as a lyrical venture but everyone's concept musically. There is often this misconception that Pete wrote the whole thing. I don't think it's the strongest thing that the band ever did. Gabriel, the story is like the Pilgrim's Progress but on the streets of New York. So it's a spiritual journey into the soul but there's quite a tough world feeding the imagery. One of the influences was a film called El Topo by Alejandro Jodorowsky, whom I later invited to work with me on a screenplay for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, something which was never completed. It was a rough, visceral cowboy spiritual film. It was unique at the time and had a really strong cult following. When I was working with Scorsese, on Passion, the original soundtrack for the film The Last Temptation of Christ, I talked about this film and he hated it. He thought it was really pretentious. I loved it and I wasn't the only one. In fact now Jodorowsky is getting recognized, that film in particular. It had these extraordinary images and this character, played by Jodorowsky himself, who had to learn lessons from each sort of guru and then kill them on his way to finding his own self. So it was a real mix of esoteric images and spiritual journey, with urban street images, and that was the blend I was trying to put together in a way that would allow more people to travel with me. As he only had the basis of an idea, Peter asked his bandmates to work separately for the first time ever. He would write the lyrics while the other four wrote the music, even if at times roles crossed. Rutherford, I think Tony and I did one lyric, but it was very much Pete's project. He wrote some music too, but it became a little bit sectionalist. Gabriel, there were parts of it where we'd be discussing lyrics and throwing some of the words around for different bits, for example in the title track, which was Tony's, musically speaking, and Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthetist, which Steve had brought to the band. They would discuss some of the lyrical stuff with me because, well, they'd sort of got the writer's ticket. But I was pretty anal about hanging on to some lyrical flow, and I really wanted a tougher edge to this record than we'd had previously. I didn't think anyone else in the band was going to deliver that. Collins, with this album it was one story, one lyric writer. What I remember most about The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was four of us in a big room jamming, writing, and recording everything, while in the other room Peter was writing lyrics to the things that were already there. Obviously, we did play some stuff all together, but it was like him and us. Gabriel's renowned slowness in writing lyrics meant the musicians had more time than usual, resulting in them writing a huge amount of material. Too much for a single album. Rutherford, I'm not sure I remember how it happened. I think we decided to do a double album to give us a bit more space. Some of the bits of music were quite short really, but we thought the 50 minutes of a single album was nothing at all and that it would constrain us. By making it much longer, it meant we could do these jams and improvisations, it gave us the chance to be a little bit freer. What's more, there were still loads of old ideas which had never been recorded that could be developed and used if and when needed. Banks, anyway, was a piece I'd written years before. We'd always liked it and here was an opportunity to use it. So there were many pieces that came from different eras really, but most of it was written in the period after Selling England by the Pound was released. Once the outline of the project had been established, to write the album the band rented out Headley Grange, previously used by other bands such as Led Zeppelin, Bad Company, and Pretty Things. The house had originally been built as a workhouse for the poor before being converted into a private home. Rutherford, Headley Grange had a lovely atmosphere, but it was a bit of a bomb site. Musically, the ideas came very fast, I mean they just flew out, but the double album workload for Pete, who was never a fast lyricist, meant that after a while he was up in the bedroom trying to catch up on the lyrics while we were downstairs doing the music. So there was a little bit of a divide there, which is a shame. Collins, it was a strange period actually. I can remember driving to Headley Grange, which I think is on the Hampshire-Surrey border. I had my first wife, Andrea, with me and my daughter, Joelle, and it was a bit like going into a Dickens novel, broken windows and rats everywhere. Bad Company had used it and Led Zeppelin had recorded a song when the Levee Breaks album there, Led Zeppelin 4, 1971. But no one had cleaned up. It was really horrible. I don't think the poor woman who owned the house knew what she was letting herself in for. You'd be walking down the corridor and 2 or 3 rats would walk past you. They wouldn't scurry away, they just walked past you and stopped to look at you. In the back garden there were these vines going up the back wall and you'd see this constant scurry of activity. And I was bringing a daughter into this and we were going to stay the night. At night, when you went to bed, you could hear this scurrying around. The place never slept. First of all we had to clear up, but we never got rid of the rats. We took over the living room to write and there was another room with a piano. Hackett, we were working in a haunted house and the ghosts were certainly keeping me awake at night. I remember talking to Robert Plant about this. They Led Zeppelin had worked at Headley Grange and he said he was convinced the place was haunted. They'd recorded stuff there, the famous drum sound in the stairwell. I heard sounds at night, the place was weird. I remember on the day we were due to leave, I was just washing my hands in the sink and I stepped back and the floor gave way. Had it happened a split second earlier, I would probably have been killed. You might say it was just coincidence, it was a ramshackle house, or you could say it was haunted by a poltergeist that nearly got another rock and roller, or maybe it was the rats scratching at night rather than the ghosts, but it was bloody hard to get to sleep at times, what with that and the geese out in the courtyard. Right in the middle of the writing sessions, in June 1974, Peter Gabriel received an unexpected proposal which put the whole future of Genesis at stake. Gabriel, I'd written a story, which went on the back cover of Genesis Live, about a woman who began stripping off in a tube train, taking off her clothes until all that was left was a tube of light. It was something that caught the fancy of William Friedkin, and he was Mr. Hot and Happening in Hollywood at the time because he'd just done The Exorcist. He wanted to use that power to try and reinvent Hollywood and bring in a whole new team of people. He invited me in as an ideas person, you know, to brainstorm and come up with different concepts and explore different areas. He'd actually approached Tangerine Dream to do the music, and there was a guy called Philip Drouillet, who was from heavy metal magazines originally known in France as Metal Hurlant, and there was an animated designer whom he wanted to work on some of the visuals. To me it was a very exciting opportunity, not because it was Hollywood, but because I love ideas, I love brainstorming with smart people. I was suddenly going to be given a vehicle and given a chance to come to life, so I really wanted to do it. But even though Phil had always been a jobbing musician and doing other things, from Tony and to some extent Mike, there was this feeling of why should he have all the fun, and this sense of no, we're not happy to make time for you to go off and piss away valuable band time when you should be committed. So it was a hot, contentious issue. With tensions running high, it took the authoritarian intervention of Tony Stratton-Smith to try and patch things up. News of the turmoil within the rock band also reached Friedkin's ears, leaving him understandably disorientated. Gabriel, I'd always loved film. I'd had a place at the London School of Film Technique in Shelton Street, and at one point it was a toss-up over whether I was going to try and follow a career as a music person or as a would-be film director. But Friedkin didn't want to be held responsible for breaking up the band. So it all got complicated and I wasn't backing down. Rutherford, during the album, Peter sort of left for a bit. I think Friedkin got a bit of a shock, his offer to Peter wasn't meant to do that. So, we were like, wow, what are we gonna do now? We needed some strong instrumental stuff, so we just carried on jamming around until he came back. Collins, we gave him an ultimatum. Friedkin or the band. So he went. But Friedkin hadn't wanted to split the band up. His was just an idea and he didn't even know if it was going to work. My first feeling when Peter left was, okay, let's just get rid of all the vocals and do it instrumentally. That was, of course, poo-pooed, quite rightly. Hackett, we started work and 3 days later he was back. I thought that provided we got the album done and toured with it, it would all be forgotten about. Banks, he was persuaded to come back, I think by Tony Stratton-Smith, and so we finished off the album. But something magic had gone, it wasn't quite the all for one it had been. Collins, at that point, of course, we all knew this could happen again at any time. When Peter came back we carried on writing and then we went to this farm in Wales to record it with John Burns using mobile recording equipment. It was great fun, it was a nicer place than Headley Grange. Banks, We recorded the album in a sort of barn somewhere in Wales using a mobile studio. This meant we had more time to do things, but as the mobile studio wasn't perhaps quite as good as it might have been, there was a sort of buzz throughout the album. But thanks to John Burns, the sound is actually very good. Doing the remixes, we found that what's actually on the tape is really good, and to be honest, the original mix isn't bad either. We changed a lot less on this one than on the previous records. We took out all buzzes and really had fun with the 5.1, for example with the different characters in the colony of Slipper Men. We tried quite hard to make it an interesting 5.1 mix. Hackett, the new mixes help with the fact that it's very crowded. There is a lot of detail on the album and it needs to be mixed very well. Originally it was very badly mixed. I remember I wasn't around for some of the mixes because I'd had an accident with a wine glass and I'd practically cut my thumb off. I was in hospital recovering, and when I heard the album, after it was mixed, I just thought, oh God. Listening to it now, I can hear so much more detail on it than in the original mixes. Despite being back in the fold, so to speak, the lead singer was afflicted by a certain sense of detachment from his bandmates, exacerbated by problems at home. Gabriel, Jill, whom I was married to at the time, and I had just had our first child, Anna Marie, born on July 26, 1974. It was a disastrous birth. We were all set for a natural birth, but Jill caught an infection from a needle which wasn't clean, and so she had a fever. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck and her lungs were full of gunk. Everything was going wrong and we didn't think she was going to survive. They carried her away like a chicken carcass wrapped up in silver paper and put her in an incubator. They wouldn't let my wife see her because they thought it would be cruel for her to bond with a baby who wasn't going to make it through. They wouldn't do that nowadays, but back then they thought they were being kind. So this became the center of everything. The band were recording, but instead of being somewhere reasonably close to where we were, in St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, they were out in Wales, so I was making these long pilgrimages. I was based in London, and whenever things looked better I'd try and zoom back to Wales for the recording. This is something I think that the band would accept now, but back then they weren't very understanding. And I just lost it in lots of ways because this was a life and death situation, and so obviously much more important than an album or anything else. There was a lot of resentment about that, and I think the seeds for the beginning of the end were sown at that point. What had begun in some arguments about creative freedom and whether or not there was room to do outside projects ended with this really unsympathetic handling of my dealing with a family crisis. Relationships had effectively broken down by the end of the record. Collins, we were all in this house even though some of us shouldn't have been because we only lived down the road. Unbeknownst to us, Jill was experiencing a very bad and difficult pregnancy. Rutherford, we began to sense that one of our party was starting to be pulled in different directions, outside the band. We were conscious that he wasn't as committed and was starting to think about other things going on in his life. To be honest, looking back, we were so unsupportive. We were young and very into the album and what we were doing, while poor old Pete was having to deal with the terribly traumatic touch-and-go birth of his daughter. We gave him no help at all, actually. I'm sure it must have been very hard. At that stage, we didn't think outside the band very much, and I think as people, friends, there wasn't much time to consider other people's likes, dislikes or wishes really. Hackett, I was relatively new to the band, but Pete, Tony, and Mike had been together since they were 12 or 13 years old, when they were at Charterhouse together. So maybe it felt like a long time in the same regiment, and eventually he felt the need to depart. I know he had other pressures, which were personal and not for me to talk about. I remember it was all very difficult, my marriage was breaking up, it looked as if we only had half a singer and the level of commitment to the band seemed very shaky at that point. All this cast a shadow over proceedings and, although I think it's a very inventive album which has some great moments on it, I still feel there was the sense of claustrophobia accompanying it. The idea that we were still trying to employ the philosophy of everyone going away together and living together, cheek by jowl, you know, when there were families and children involved, wasn't a healthy kind of environment for everybody. That Gabriel was the first person in the band to have a child is urban legend. Hackett's son, Oliver, was born on February 28, 1974, and Collins had adopted his first wife's 2-year-old daughter, Joelle. Evidently the singer's difficult family issues had a much bigger impact than the guitarists and drummers. It was that kind of growing up phase, and we had to grow up very quickly at that point because we were going to lose our lead singer. It was a time of great uncertainty and I moved on to writing solo stuff. Meanwhile, the audiences were growing and they weren't aware of all this. The album. When The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway appeared in record shops the world over, the response it received from fans and journalists was very varied. Genesis had faced the winds of change blowing through both the musical world and their own personal lives with courage and intelligence. The album represented a significant break from the traditional Genesis sound. The 12 strings, although still present, were now substantially reduced to a mainly rhythmic and chordal role, with the usual dreamy arpeggios limited to a bare minimum, and Tony relied less on the orchestral sounds of his mellotron in favor of bringing out a whole myriad of electronic sounds from his synthesizers. Meanwhile, Steve's guitar playing, maybe with the exception of a single classic solo, in the Lamia, engaged in experimental sounds, for example the rhythm in Counting Out Time, and riffs surprisingly verging on hard rock, Lily White Lilith. However, despite Steve having bought a synth hi-fi to get more effects out of his guitar, on the whole the overall instrumentation was less elaborate. The rhythms turned out to be dry and hypnotic. Phil's drumming, now free to express itself on material leaning more towards rock, is beyond superlative, and Mike pulled off a magnificent performance not only on bass, uncharacteristically hard, and often made more intense by using a fuzz box, but also as an extraordinary and untiring 12-string rhythm guitarist. On the vocal side, Gabriel, with the help of Phil, gave his most mature performance to date. However, one cannot fail to notice, in terms of balance within the band, that The Lamb represents a step backwards compared to the perfect equilibrium achieved on Selling England by the Pound. Musically speaking, the album is dominated by the writing of Tony and Mike, with compositional contributions from the other three reduced to a mere flicker. Gabriel wrote Counting Out Time and The Chamber of 32 Doors with a few other bits and pieces here and there. Collins provided only Lily White Lilith, and even that was actually written 3 years earlier, while Hackett, in the midst of a family crisis back home, limited his writing contribution to Cuckoo Cocoon, Hairless Heart, Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthetist, and the intro to Colony of Slipper Men. Then, of course, the intricate narrative plot, written exclusively by Gabriel, is a chapter unto itself. It is, without doubt, the most complicated piece of work to emerge from the lead singer's imagination, full of extremely varied and often obscure literary and cultural references. What's more, as all too often pointed out by Banks, it was almost impossible to extract individual songs from the album due to the lyrics being almost incomprehensible when taken out of context. Finally, the internal friction brought with it another consequence, the net division of roles. For the first time ever, Tony didn't play a single note on the guitar but stuck exclusively to keyboards, and neither he nor Mike were allowed to sing backing vocals. The vocals were also strictly divided, with Peter on lead and Phil on harmonies. That said, on a purely artistic level. The Lamb is a monumental piece of work which only served to further enhance the band's reputation. And even though at first listen it may not be as immediate as its predecessors, it still represents a significant artistic step forward. Genesis were aware of the changing times and, more than the individual songs it contains, it is the outstanding value of the overall vision itself that shines supreme. It is an album where profoundly different atmospheres alternate, the electronic experimentation of the waiting room, the colony of Slipperman and Ravine, the dramatic emphasis of Broadway melody of 1974, In the Cage, the Chamber of 32 Doors, the expressive hardness of Lily White Lilith, Back in New York City, It, and the occasional heart-wrenching tenderness of Carpet Crawlers and Cuckoo Cocoon. With an insight which proved to be light years ahead of their contemporaries, already slipping irreversibly into the realms of self-parody, Jethro Tull with War Child, Emerson, Lake and Palmer with their pretentious Welcome Back My Friends, yes, with the Relayer album, Genesis showed themselves ready to embrace a new stage in their career at a historical moment in which the rock cosmos appeared to be on the lookout for new stimuli. Meanwhile, the prog flag was kept flying thanks to successful albums from veterans King Crimson with their Starless and Bible Black, and up-and-coming bands like Camel, Mirage, and Supertramp. Crime of the Century, David Bowie was continuing along the path of the concept album with his Diamond Dogs, and hard rock witnessed the metamorphosis of Deep Purple with Burn, the very first with David Coverdale on vocals. In America, Bob Dylan and Lou Reed were still going strong with new studio albums, respectively Planet Waves and Sally Can't Dance, and spectacular live albums, Before the Flood and Rock and Roll Animal, while, on the other side of America, Jackson Browne pulled the masterpiece Late for the Sky out of the hat. Despite being full of great albums, 1974 still didn't seem to be a particularly innovative year, apart from the extraordinary Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt. Even the aristocracy of rock proved to be no exception. With the Beatles firmly in his past, John Lennon released Walls and Bridges, while the Stones brought out It's Only Rock and Roll, the title song from which is mentioned by Gabriel in it. In truth, a dark shadow was stalking the halls of rock, ready to shatter its very foundations. It wouldn't be long before punk exploded on the scene and, as bizarre as it may sound, Gabriel's Genesis played a part in bringing these changes about, starting with the leading character in their double concept, the street punk, Rail, who couldn't possibly have been further away from the elves and fairies of the stereotype prog imagery. The urban, edgy literary premise to which the band would set their soundtrack was stylistically miles away from the record released just 1 year earlier. An album which has always sparked controversy, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway stands as a unique and autonomous work in Genesis' highly fertile artistic career. The biggest regret lies in never knowing what might have happened afterwards if Gabriel hadn't decided to walk out of the door never to return. The songs on the album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Record first, Side A, Song first, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The double album opens with a memorable piano intro which, due to the unusual sequence of notes, Tony was forced to play with his hands crossed over. Very remote from the dreamy atmospheres permeating their work of just a year before, the song has a disturbing air made even more sinister by the annoying buzz created by Hackett's guitar, filtered through 2 fuzz boxes, and Mike Rutherford's distorted bass. Rutherford, the piano riff is great. Pete sets up the image, describing the New York scene. I think the lyrics really paint a picture of the album. Banks, I always think of it as being the last song Peter and I ever wrote together. We'd written a lot together in the early days, you know, it was a pretty good song to end on really. Record first, Side A, Song second, Fly on a Windshield. Collins, we called it Pharaohs originally because it was like a trip down the Nile in ancient Egypt. It was a piece of ambient music really, but with rhythm. Banks, we were just playing fifths, you know, creating a sort of Egyptian army coming across the landscape. We had a quiet section and a loud one and we just sort of butt joined them together. Then, combined with the lyrics, this idea of the fly coming and hitting your windshield, that moment when that first chord comes in, is probably the single best moment in Genesis history. Divided into two parts, a vocal section and the instrumental part, the song starts with Mike's 12-string guitar chords, accompanied by electric piano with some distant mellotron. Generally, the mellotron is featured less than on previous releases, although it is still responsible for some of the album's most striking moments. Banks, maybe it was because I'd switched to the little mellotron, or maybe because the album was harder edged and needed it less. When I did use it, I often combined it with other sounds. For example, on Fly on a Windshield I had the strings and the RMI electro piano playing in unison with it all the time because mellotrons lacked real edge. A lovely sound but a nightmare instrument to play. The instrumental section features Steve's lead guitar playing over Banks' title mellotron chords. Hack it, it's a lovely piece of music, where the guitar comes to the fore, rising and falling. As a guitarist, I love the parallels with Ravel's Bolero, the key change and the very interesting lyrics Pete wrote, with this strange parade of lost or bygone souls in the subsequent section, Broadway Melody of 1974. An interesting take on America, I think that's why I like it the best, lyrically speaking. Record first, Side A, Song third, Broadway Melody of 1974. Written by Banks, Rutherford, and Gabriel and tagged onto the tail end of Fly on a Windshield, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The song exploits rhythmic bass riffs, drums, and electric guitar synchronized over the original chord sequence played on the mellotron and Peter's singing. Hackett, I think it was the band at its most percussively interesting. It was also harmonically adventurous. I don't think there is another song I've ever heard that sounds quite like it. It's just a mixture of romantic and malevolent. I think we were operating on telepathy at that point. Record first, Side A, Song fourth, Cuckoo Cocoon. A gentle track marked by the electric guitar arpeggio played by Steve with a decisive compositional contribution from his brother, John, dating back to their younger days when they would play together at home. Hackett, John, my brother, had an influence as he suggested the two opening chords, but in a different rhythm. I wrote the vocal melody line and Peter wrote the lyrics. It was intended to sound sweet originally, with a harmony vocal, but I think it came out strong and quirky. The filtered voice of Peter, who also manages to find space to fit in some flute solos, is enriched by Phil, who basically sings the whole song alongside the lead singer. Record first, Side A, Song fifth, In the Cage. Written at home by Banks and brought into the band almost complete, this song starts on Rutherford's pulsating and distorted bass running under the organ chords and Gabriel's vocal intro. Steve's electric guitar introduces the verses with arpeggios and underlines the choruses with circular phrases, while a powerful bass riff, at 3 minutes and 9 seconds, leads into Tony's fantastic synthesizer solo. Banks, it was exciting this one, always a climax on stage, particularly the later live version of it. Pete struggled a bit with the vocals on this one when he was doing it live. The trouble with Peter was that his voice sounded good when it was just on the edge of cracking up, but, of course, it was very difficult for him to do live. He couldn't sing it all really, and in those days we couldn't really change the keys of songs very easily. Songs like this had a pretty complicated solo, and so to suddenly change the key midstream would have driven me nuts. Record first, Side A, Song sixth, The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging. Banks, Pete had a moment in his plot which needed a song and we didn't have one. I just started playing these two chords, a dopey kind of riff really. I quite like one-note things. Pigeons off the EP Spot the Pigeon, 1977 is a good example of that. I just keep one note going through the whole thing and just change the chords underneath it, letting it build. Then what Pete did on top was kind of wild, and he didn't really make any use of the melodic content of the piece, but I think it works very well. It's always been one of my favorite songs on this record because I think it's quirky, it's very Genesis, no one else would do a song like this. And it builds to a nice climax with a few weird chords. An atypical case, as it was written directly in the studio following the theme as outlined by Gabriel, who had already written the lyrics. This song comes in with a strange keyboard march from under which Peter's voice, filtered by some electronic wizardry worked by Brian Eno, emerges. A real surprise for a band as notoriously self-sufficient as Genesis. Gabriel, I was, and still am, a fan of what Brian Eno does and brings to projects. For us, this was an adventurous album, and I really wanted him to come in and wave his magic wand over a few of the sound areas, which we called enossification. I think Phil then did a couple of albums for Brian. We probably didn't pay him very much, we didn't have very much in those days, and I knew he was impressed with Phil, and I think that's how they ended up working together. Collins, Eno was upstairs doing his first solo album, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. I'd heard of Roxy Music, but I'd never heard their music, but Peter was a fan and he asked Eno to come down and put the vocals through his ARP. After finishing recordings, some deal was made and I was sent upstairs to play drums on his record. That was fine by me because I ended up getting to know him very well and playing on Another Green World, Before and After Science and Music for Films. But I felt like some kind of musical prostitute. Rutherford, Brian Eno came with a synthesizer and put the voice through it and sort of messed around with some sounds, but I think he was mainly involved in filtering the voice. There weren't many synthesizers to choose from back then, and he was always quite brave in what he did. Banks, the Eno thing was always a bit of a red herring. People think he did more than he actually did. Sometimes I've even been asked what I was doing while he was playing all those solos. What he did was put little fiddly bits on the vocals mainly and a couple of other things, but he didn't play anything. The day he was there, I think it may have been towards the end of recording the album, I wasn't in the studio. We were totally running out of time and we were doing day and night shifts. I might have been ill or something, or maybe I was on the night shift the day he came to the studio. While even a whistle adds some color to a truly bizarre piece, the marching is emphasized by Phil's drumming. Vocal inserts articulate paranoid situations which evolve in a continuous crescendo up to a kind of final, almost paroxysmal, slowing down where at 2 minutes and 23 seconds another deeper voice do bless Gabriel's vocals. Banks, it's an octave divider. In those days we used whatever was available, and these things only existed in studios at the time. Record first, side B, song first, back in New York City. Rutherford, I love this track. It was one of our heaviest tracks actually. It doesn't sound that way so much on the record, but on stage it really was, with Pete's voice just belting it out. The opening is punctuated by dull tympanic beats and Mike's pulsating bass. Rutherford, I had a 6-string bass, a microfret, which I'd found in America. I've never seen another one since. You could play it an octave higher. I wrote the riff with the band. I remember we did a lot of jamming and improvising, and we were thinking it was a shame Pete wanted to move on because it was sounding really good musically. Banks, it started off with a riff Mike was playing on this 6-string bass he had, which we then op at as a song. Then Pete just did the sort of shouting type vocal on it. At the time, it was quite surprising, but I think it works pretty well. Intercalated with a harsh and syncopated synth riff, Gabriel's deliberately graceless voice comes in almost straight away, rough and shouted, on the very edge of intonation. It is an approach one could almost say heralds punk. Banks, I heard a version of this by Jeff Buckley on the album Sketches for My Sweetheart the Drunk. I was very surprised that he did the whole thing including the funny bits. If I'd been him I would have just stuck to the main thing. But it was fun and quite sweet really, it was kind of why not. Mike was playing extreme bass. We wanted to get melody out of the bass as well as the guitar. During this period Peter, Mike, and I were the main writers. Phil and Steve both did the odd bit but they weren't very involved in the writing. So the main parts of this are Mike's and the bits that come later, the ones that are less good, are mine. We repeated the riff as much as we thought we could get away with, and at the time it seemed like we stayed on it for too long. It was always difficult for us to do repetition at this stage, we always liked to go somewhere else than stay with one thing. We had a lot of ideas and wanted to try and get them all in. I think Peter sings this really well. I like the build-up, the piano is quite heavily compressed and the interesting sound and the chords are suggested by the riff. But I hate the line "shave it off," shaving hair off the heart, it's a horrible concept. Then, of course, the next piece which Steve and I sat and wrote together, this rather grand and beautiful piece of music, ended up being called Hairless Heart. What a horrible title. Record first, side B, song second, Hairless Heart. This is an intensely beautiful instrumental track dominated by Hackett's guitar playing, on both nylon and electric guitar, and Tony's mellotron chords and organ arpeggio, with the melodic phrase provided by an ARP Pro soloist synthesizer. Banks, Steve had a really nice melody so I just did the fluttery things behind it. I added this bit which I'd had around for a long time but hadn't found a home for, a kind of semi-orchestral thing. It was nice though. Because it was a double album we were able to include all these instrumental interludes. Record first, side B, song third, counting out time. Banks, this is a really good song Peter had written before we started writing The Lamb. In a different world, it might have been a hit, if we'd been in a position of having hit records at the time. I like the lyrics as well, it's cheeky. Written exclusively by Gabriel, this is a catchy song with a verse, chorus structure with variations and inventive successions of chords and rhythmic riffs, plus a truly original solo by Hackett on guitar lying over a cheery rhythm guitar and Dixie jazz piano. Banks, the guitar solo in the middle is really good. The piano with the echo was fun to play. I was playing the piano in Dixieland style, which was pretty much in the original composition by Pete, so I can't take much credit for that. Counting Out Time was the first single taken from The Lamb, but it failed to make any impact at all. Banks, back in the 60s I was very good at picking hits for other people, but by this time I had no idea. I knew it had to be quite simple and I thought this was quite bouncy but it didn't do anything. If a record doesn't get played on the radio, that's it, it won't be successful. Obviously, this song recalls things like Harold the Barrel and Willow Farm, which have that same kind of quirky, quite Beatles-ish quality about them. We always loved the Beatles and this has a McCartney kind of bounce to it. Hackett, it was the nearest thing to a single on the album. But it was a trifle risk and I think possibly not as strong as it could have been musically speaking. I think you need a bit more of a hook. Banks, in any case, it's still played because it's a pop song and I think it works nicely. It's simpler compared with a lot of the other things on the album and it's all about early sexual experiences, trying to do it by the book. Record first, side B, song fourth, Carpet Crawlers. Another song where as with the grand parade of lifeless packaging, Gabriel's lyrics came first and the music, written by Tony and Mike second. Banks, Mike and I wrote the chord sequence really, and then Pete sang on it and Phil did a bit as well. It's a funny thing with music, the listener just hears the music, the lyrics, and that's the song to them. But when you are writing music, it's what you start with that is most important. If you get a good basis, you can probably write 100 good songs on it. Like when we did Mama from the album Genesis 1983 for example, Mike played that drum box rhythm and we knew that we could write a good song on that repeated loop. No matter what we did, it was going to work. The same applies here, we could have done 100 melodies on this and it would have sounded good. The verse melody is different every time really, but it sounds good. As well as the lyrics, Peter also wrote the melody. Gabriel, I love the melody of Carpet Crawlers. I was staying with Jill's parents in Kensington and there was an old out-of-tune piano. I spent hours and hours on it honing that melody and then the lyric. Banks, there's a really good melody on this, very strong. It was one of those things that emerged in the rehearsal room, out of nothing really. It's nice, and with the slow build-up you could always recapture the audience. It starts slowly but then with its repetition and character it's very nostalgic. The only problem really is that out of context, the lyric is a bit weird. On the album it's fine, but if you put it out as a single, as we did, people want to know what it means. The chorus, obviously, is catchy and could work, especially with the combination of the two voices, with Phil singing the other bit. Phil always sang this beautifully. In the later days, after Peter left, this song always sounded really good. I'm not crazy about the version we did with Trevor Horn for the Greatest Hits album Turn It On Again, The Hits, 1999, but the vocals on it, the way it switches from Peter to Phil in the middle is really strong. We were really lucky to have two such strong singers in the group. The beginning of the song is based on a section taken from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Banks, I wanted to reprise this. I don't know why, but I think the bit I'd written in the middle of the title track starting at 2 minutes and 34 seconds needed hearing again. It was a good bit, so I did it again and we developed it into Carpet Crawlers. Mike and I sat down and did a really simple sequence and Pete sang on it. After the intro, the song structure becomes extremely linear, with verse and chorus repeated 4 times. Without doubt this is one of the simplest chord sequences in the history of Genesis, with Gabriel's and Colin's vocals and the finishing touch provided by Hackett on lead guitar. Hackett, I did this melody that was designed to parallel the vocal. On the original mix it's almost inaudible, but I think you can hear it on the new version. People like it as a song, you've got interesting stuff in it, Phil's doubling himself so you've got 2 drummers, you've got this slowed down 12-string thing, or sped up keyboards, I can't remember. It's got that very shimmery quality thanks to Tony's arpeggios on the RMI piano and Mike on 12-string, most people today would use a pad, chords on keyboard that would just sit there and create this sort of wallpaper glue behind the whole thing. The chord work is very subtle. Banks, it's very simple and I think that's half its charm. Some things with Genesis are a bit overworked. The chorus is a little bit different and the fact that the song slowly crescendos means it kind of just creeps into you. The other songs are a bit meandering so this one stands out like a very bright spark in the middle of the album. When we wrote it we had no idea it was going to be picked for release as a single, we thought the single was going to be Counting Out Time. We did release it in April 1975 but it wasn't a hit or anything. We've tried releasing it again, it's still never done anything, but it's one of those tracks that our own audience loves. Record first, Side B, Song 5th, The Chamber of 32 Doors. With a backdrop of Banks' beautiful mellotron chords, Hackett's heart-wrenching guitar solo melody precedes the drum breaks and bass, emphasized with the help of tubular bells followed by the entry of Peter's and Phil's voices while a bass riff dominates over the organ bass. Banks, it's a kind of bitty piece, mainly written by Peter, but it was arranged quite nicely. Steve and I sort of orchestrated it to get a particular sound. I think the second side is in many ways the strongest of the four. The whole album up to this point is really strong, and it would have been a really good single album if you added just a couple of pieces from the second half. Record second, side C, song first, Lily White Lilith. The second LP opens with an unusually hard song with distorted guitar and bass riff playing in unison over heavy drumming and a keyboard bass which comes in almost at the same time as Gabriel's vocals, to which Collins' harmonies are added in the cho ruses. The track is a surgical operation which stitches together two fragments of songs written by the drummer shortly after he joined the band in 1970. Banks. When Phil first joined us he had this piece called The Light. We did a version on stage and it was probably one of the best songs we never recorded. It started off with this bit which we used at the beginning of Lily White Lilith, not with the same lyrics obviously, and Phil came up with a second part which became the chorus. That dramatic chord change 037 came with the original song The Light, although that wasn't part of what Phil wrote but something that came up in his rehearsal room. This early example of the songwriter of Phil Collins is an absolute rarity, as at that time Collins was anything but a songwriter. Banks, he didn't have the confidence to write very much but he had this one bit that he'd had for a while, and then he came up with another piece we thought we would use as it had really nice chords. He came in with them and sat at the piano and played them for us. During Lily White Lilith you can hear a reprise of the Broadway melody theme with different lyrics, the bit starting with She Leaves Me in My Darkness at 1:45 and slightly simpler melody line, same chords, although played in a different key. It's a good driving piece for a story, almost operatic. It's interesting because instead of going up it comes down and leads into the waiting room, which was another improvised piece. Record second, side C, song second, The Waiting Room. An experimental instrumental developed by the whole band starting with an idea put forward by Hackett. It incorporates interesting effects especially in the use of guitars and synthesizers, but also percussion, strings, bell sounds and delays. Banks, we tried to keep it as improvised as we could right to the end. The best version we ever did of it was the first one when we were in this rather spooky place, Headley Grange, where we wrote the album. We switched off all the lights and Steve got a glint in his eye as he likes to do that darker stuff. The first time we did it we were genuinely frightened. While we were doing it I started playing this very simple 2-chord sequence, to lighten things up, and everyone joined in and it became this great piece. It was fabulous, but every time we tried to play it after that, changing from being evil to happy, it never really worked. It was still quite fun but it was never as good. If only we'd had a tape recorder at that stage, we could have taped it. Experimentation led the band to produce a whole series of really bizarre sounds, such as the sort of lamenting ghosts at 1:18. Banks, you could get some strange sounds out of the pro-soloist, like the gurgly sound with Echo 1:45. I really like the sound of the check 2:48 played low with some vibrato on it. Mike didn't have much to do here and Pete just went off. I thought he could have done some more vocal things but he didn't. Steve and I are sort of talking to each other. Of course, we didn't have the tools at our disposal as you would today with synthesizers. Mike was trying to do something but I'm not quite sure what. When I started to play some happy chords 306, Mike thought, thank God, now I can do something. We added the crash as a way to end it, but, on the original, it just started to come out into this bit much more spontaneously. It's very simple chords and there's a nice bit of bass and guitar, and Phil can't help sort of tricksying it up a bit. Collins, that period, between this album and the next 3 or 4 years with Brand X and Gen. Isis, was probably the height of my playing. But there was a lot of inventive stuff from everybody. Steve, for example, was a great sound guy, and Tony was getting the maximum out of what he had. Songs like The Waiting Room display a side of Genesis that no one, apart from the ardent fans, really remembers. They either forget about it or have never heard it. And I think it's actually the way we would end up writing, by doing things like that. That's how songs like I Can't Dance and No Son of Mine started. We just started playing The Waiting Room with the idea of changing the mood from darkness to light. We started off making noises and Steve added lots of eerie sounds, and outside it was pouring with rain. Then Tony put some chords in 3/06 and suddenly it started changing rhythm, and then there was a rainbow and it stopped raining and the sun came out. I'm not making it up, I was there and it happened, and it was the most amazing thing. It was just a little golden 8 or 9 minute moan. Record second, side C, song third, anyway. Banks. On the Lamb we absorbed 1 or 2 bits that had been around for a while, like the light. We were kind of searching through everything we had, and anything we thought was good we would use. This piece was from a long time before, even before Genesis was happening. I probably wrote it at university, at the same time as writing things like Fountain of Cis, and we used it for the radio documentary on the painter Michael Jackson. I can't recall if we even had a lyric for it then. In fact, a quite different version to the one which ended up on the album, recorded for the BBC in 1970, when Phillips and Mayhew were still in the band, would come to light in 2008 on the Genesis 1970-1975 box set under the title Frustration. The song revolves around a beautiful piano arpeggio sitting on a bass, drums, and tambourine backdrop over which an intense performance by Peter reigns supreme. Banks, it's just a pianistic type of thing, based on a little riff with different chords underneath it. It has a strong start and then we elaborated the middle part and made it a bit grander. After the guitar riffs and an almost orchestral break, Hackett's impressive solo takes off. 156. Banks, Steve played a 3-part harmony. He used to like to work out his solos very carefully. He wasn't really an improviser, which was okay with me because I wasn't either. Sometimes with guitar, you can free yourself up a little bit. Without a doubt the best solo he ever did with us was on Firth of Fifth. He had a structured melody somewhere but he gave himself the opportunity to just drift a little. Record second, side C, song fourth, Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthetist. 2 chords on rhythm guitar by Mike provide the wonderfully simple bass on which Peter's and Phil's voices lie as they sing together before a long instrumental section, incorporating some bizarre vocalizations from Gabriel and Collins but with Steve's lead guitar very much at the fore. Banks, I didn't have much to do with this one to be honest, it emerged one day when I wasn't in the studio. I don't think I played on it at all. It's a ollie and undemanding piece. Again it's Steve writing in a very structured way and you can blues it around a bit and get some ideas from that. Anyhow, it's not my favorite. Record second, side C, song fifth, The Lamia. Banks, this was again a whole piece I'd written. It didn't have a melody when I brought it to the band, but that was suggested by the various parts I already had. Pete wrote a lot of words for the song which I then took home, over Christmas, I think it was, and wrote a melody using his words on top of the part I'd written. It's a nice song but it's not, to me, totally successful, not like some of the ones on the album. It's not one I look back on with great pride, but it has some nice parts. The song is dominated by piano with vocals mirroring the chords while the drums and bass come into play the main hook. Banks, I love the part from 108, which we then, of course, reprised in The Light Dies Down on Broadway. I think it works much better in that song. I really like this chord sequence. The final section is a long and moving guitar solo from Steve. Banks, again there was the problem with the lyric factor. 3 Vermilion Snakes is hardly romantic. If they had said I love you, baby, it would have been great. I have a problem with the lyrics in what I call my 3 big pieces on this album, In the Cage, The Lamia, and The Colony of Slippermen. In the Cage just about gets away with it, but Slippermen, you know, I had great plans for that, but I think that the one song I've written hat most resembles The Lamia is One for the Vine, which is a much better song than this because I was able to write a lyric that fitted the shape of the song better. Record 2nd, Side C, Song 6th, Silent Sorrow in Empty Boats. A brief instrumental piece written by Rutherford, an almost ambient piece which insistently repeats a single phrase with an orchestral feel made up of 6 notes. Banks, this one is another improvisation, which was called Victory at Sea, so it starts very quietly while we were trying to recreate that kind of feeling of an ocean wave. Mike just had this one riff and it had a nice atmosphere about it, so we just improvised around it with the mellotron sounds that I had at the time, voices and other strange things, and bits of flute and stuff which keep going up and down like waves. Collins, it would be good if people remembered that the band which played Silent Sorrow on Empty Boats, which is like, you know, sailing ships, clouds and fog, is the same band that played Hold on My Heart. The same band, the same mentality. Record 2nd, Side D, Song 1st, The Colony of Slippermen. The last side of the double album opens with a song full of extraordinary electronic effects and which is divided into 3 parts, Arrival/A Visit to the Doctor/Raven. To this, we should add an intro played on electric guitar featuring sounds with a distinctly oriental influence. Banks, the introduction was something we called the Chinese jam, which Steve was quite into. I helped out with what I could and I think it's okay. It's color more than anything else and it doesn't really introduce the song at all. We didn't give it a title, I don't know why. We should have. Peter's voice kicks in accompanied by a joyous keyboard phrase over a happy rhythm and circling electric guitar melody. Banks, when I wrote this I thought it could be really good, but it's the one that got away a bit. The keyboard sequence 150 could have been really powerful with the right melody and the right lyric. It's funny because what I play on the bass line is very similar to a song by the Manic Street Preachers. I think the drums are a bit too clever, they should have been simpler. Having said that, I don't want to put it down too much. I think it works in a different way, it's still a fun piece of music, but it didn't come out quite how I thought it would. I was quite right to write the triplets in 6/8 because you can change it to 6 or break it up to 3s or 2s and it changes the feel of it. The riff at 259 would have worked better as a piano part really. The tone of the synthesizer is slightly cheesy sometimes, I would have liked to have had a different one, but, alternating different voices, with both Gabriel and Collins involved in interpreting various characters woven into the lyrics, lead into a synthesizer solo. Banks, that was something that came separately. Again, it Mike, Phil, and I, just bluesing around. It was always a tongue-in-cheek solo, the chords were very traditional rock-like and it was a bit of a joke but ended up sounding pretty exciting. I'd done a similar sort of thing on Apocalypse in 9/8. There are a couple of bits where I was having a bit of a joke, but sometimes these things come out stronger than you expect. The bit I like best, however, is at 402, the riffs before the beginning of Raven, which originally came from the light, but without the melody. At 4:52 another solo kicks in which Genesis would recycle years later as part of the 80s versions of Cinema Show. Banks, one quality of the pro soloist is the way the portamento works, giving it a great sound, the squelchy bass. The way we get back into the verse 601 was one of our worst changes ever. It's terribly, I'd change it. But it used to be terrible to have to change between two keys. Record second, side D, song second, Ravine. Banks, this is another of the improvised ones. Steve produced that sort of windy noise with his guitar using a fuzz box and a wah-wah pedal. Mike did a 4-chord sequence on the 12-string. Nice though. Record second, side D, song third, The Light Dies Down on Broadway. The initial wind effect provided by the synthesizer is counterpointed by Steve's electric guitar playing over Mike's 12-string arpeggios. Gabriel's voice comes in with the bass and drums. There are 4 sung sections, 2 of which are mutations of other songs off the album. Banks, this was definitely the best thing done on this side of the album because it gives it real weight. It was made up of 2 previously used bits just done slightly slower. The chords in this melody gave us a chance to bring out a little more than with the lamb itself, especially on the chorus part. The verse part is from the Lamia, which was my part, but the hook 122 is from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which Peter and I wrote together, and we decided to do the arrangement a bit slower here. It often works that a slower arrangement of a faster piece can be quite exciting. Different arrangements are something we've done many times in our career, and this is a good example. The harmonies on this are great. This track full of reprises gives a sense of continuity to the whole album. Banks, yes, that's right. Sometimes you do something and you can tell that it could be used in more than one context. This is the only song on the album where the lyrics weren't written by Gabriel. Banks, Peter was taking a hell of a long time to get the lyrics finished, so we said, for God's sake, just let us do one, which saved a bit of time. So Mike and I did the lyrics on this. We were just told what action had to take place in it. Record second, side D, Sun Riding the Scree. Opened by a melody multiple made up of bass and rhythm guitar, both by Mike, over Phil's amazing drumming. This song is most frequently remembered for Tony's extraordinary synth solo. Banks, this was a devil. The first part is ridiculous. I hate it. Well, I like it when I get past the first bit in 1/8 or whatever this bloody piece is in. It was a nightmare. Rutherford's riff is primarily in 9/8, but the track is highly complex, with time signature changes. Mike had this riff and I thought I'd try to do something by playing against it, so I played in 4/4, which sounds alright. There are bits where I broke it up into slabs so it would make more sense. It was quite good for the title, I think. At 1:05 there is synth part which the band would reuse years later in their live shows. Banks, we used the melody as the peak of the Cinema Show in later years just because it's a nice tune and it sounds good in the other rhythm. You had to keep your head playing this sort of thing, because if you got out of sync you'd be gone. There's the extra beat at the end of each section and I'd forget about it and just do my own thing, hoping they'd come back at some point. Hackett doesn't play on this track. Banks, there were a few times that Steve didn't play at all on the album. I've said many times that Phil, Mike, and I would often do some of the solos, such as in Apocalypse in 9/8 or Cinema Show, on our own, just the 3 of us. That's why we were so happy to write as a trio when we got to the stage where it was just the 3 of us. We had done it so many times before that, we had a natural way of doing it, so it worked really well, although it was mainly instrumentals at this stage. Record second, side D, song 5th, In the Rapids. Rutherford's chord sequence on 12-string, interspersed with arpeggio sections, provide the intro to Gabriel's vocals. Later the bass, piano, and electric guitar join in while the drums play softly with a touch of what sounds like cowbell. Banks, Mike wrote this. It's nice as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far, it's just another filler piece. Pete was just storytelling on top, he didn't use the chords to develop a nice melody or anything. I'm doing my Floyd Kramer bits over the top, the tinkling piano at 119, a bit like Ketty Lester's Love Letters. When we did the live CD for the first box set Archive 1967-75, Pete had to redo most of the vocals as it was all a bit rough. The song that really sounded great with the new vocals was In the Rapids. I just thought it sounded fantastic. It's a fairly insubstantial piece of music, but it sounded more like what he does now. It has an odd lyric, but we could never quite develop it. It was a nice beginning of something, but we could never really get it beyond that stage, so we decided to just leave it as it was. That said, The Lamb was that sort of album where you could have pieces that weren't complete, we just used them as a link, so again we just did a sort of slow build. Record second, side D, song fifth, IT. The final track on this monumental double album is driven by Rutherford's rhythm guitar after a long note played on the synthesizer. Over the propulsive rhythm section, complicated lead guitar and synth parts intertwine. As in other songs, Hackett and Banks play in harmony both in instrumental sections and under the vocal line. Banks, it's a nice song, but it's not a final piece. We couldn't really work out what we wanted to do. Steve and I had written it and we had originally thought it would just be instrumental. Steve and I had worked out a solo on it, a tricksy kind of thing, and then, of course, Pete wanted to sing on it. We didn't know if we had enough room, so it starts off with a solo as the verse, which is a bit odd. The portamento on the pro soloist was very slow, which was quite fun. The basic riff is nice, but it could have been better. We shouldn't really have started off with the instrumental. What Pete sings on this is good, we could have just done more of this. Really, Collins, we were really pushed to get the album finished. We were at Island Studios and by this point we had a day shift and a night shift. I was on the night shift with Peter and the day shift was Tony, Mike, and Steve. Me and Pete did a mix of it and then the other guys came in and thought we were mad and changed everything. There was a bit of friction. Banks, we were doing day and night shifts and, in this instance, I wasn't mixing this one. I came in on the day shift, after they'd mixed this, and it was awful. They'd obviously been up all night and were completely zonked, it just sounded terrible, there was no guitar for a start, and that's what it's all about, strong guitars. So that proves you can't work all through the night. The album artwork. After 3 album covers created by Whitehead, which were the epitome of the progressive scene, and the artwork by Swanwick, so eccentrically English, The Lamb required an album sleeve befitting of the radical change in style it represented. Consequently, the band turned to the art design group Hypnosis and used a model, named Omar, to pose as Rael. Hackett, for years Hypnosis had been trying to get us to use a photographic cover. They always wanted everything to be edgy and the band always wanted something much more, to Hypnosis' mind, airy-fairy. They were like, yes, you want all this romantic stuff. Why can't you have something that's contemporary, photographic, literal, perspective-driven? I don't think this is the greatest cover ever. I think they did do some great covers, for Led Zeppelin for example, but perhaps because they were more open to some of their ideas. Like with Presents, where you have a family sitting around a table staring at something in the middle and no one really knows what it is. Everyone was sure that they didn't want their photograph on the front. No one ever wanted their own face on the front of an album, not until Phil did Face Value, but that's another story. I didn't have any great ideas at the time, but his cover was desperately trying to be enigmatic, an attempt to be less romantic. Banks, I think it works pretty well. It shows images from the story and has a kind of graphic novel quality about it, which I quite like because I'm a bit of a graphic novel fan. I quite like the dark side of it. It was a question of whether or not to do it bigger and cover the whole album or just use that central band. Also, the group lettering we used for the band logo, which we came back to a few times later in our career, looks very strong. All the previous albums had been a bit more romantic, whereas, here, having a stark black and white cover like that made you aware that this wasn't going to be quite as cuddly as some as our previous stuff. Gabriel, I really like Storm Thorgerson from Hypnosis. He was a wonderful character, very dry, cynical, sardonic and very talented. He was a lot of fun to interact with. He was always rude to everybody, but it was great exchanging ideas with him. He always had this bag of unused Hypnosis ideas that he'd try to palm as off new and fresh. But here there was a story and some strong ideas for pictures. I had a sort of Puerto Rican figure in my head, perhaps influenced by West Side Story as well as El Topo, and I remember a big search to try and find someone acceptable as Rael. I think we got pretty close, but it was sort of like 8.5 out of 10. Collins, I feel it's a little bit confused, just like the story. It's a distinct package and at least it evokes something. You know, I don't think I've actually ever read the story inside it. Gabriel, there's this sprawling story on the inside. It's not well written, but it has some good ideas. Maybe the others were less happy with the cover because it was a visualization of the story, and I may have, you know, moved beyond the democratic process, and that didn't go down well. Epilogue. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was released in November 1974 when the band had already started the accompanying tour. It only managed to position itself at number 10 in the UK charts, 7 places lower than its predecessor, while in the US the band improved its standing, reaching number 41, Selling England only made it to number 70. Gabriel, some of it does sound clumsy and awkward, but it has a character and, apart from Supper's Ready, which I think is more successful in creating an emotional journey, I think this is the most successful and evocative body of work we ever did, even though there are a couple of low points on it that let the steam out a little. Banks, I suppose, looking back on it, it's something of a classic, but I didn't really enjoy writing or making it to the same extent as I did all the other albums. There's a lot of my stuff on the Lamb. A lot of bits I'd had around for a while ended up in the Lamb and in the Cage, as well as in the Lamia and the Colony of Slippermen. We did a lot of improvising as well, which created some of the most exciting bits on the album. Gabriel, a lot of it was created in band format, and quite often, when I was outside working on some of my own bits or lyrics or melodies, they would evolve new sections, but I don't think it's true to say that I featured less in the musical composition, although I probably had less to do with the jam creating process. Banks, I like all the individual lyrics, but I don't like the story. I've said many times before that it's like a Kurt Vonnegut novel but without the direction. It reminds me a bit of Breakfast of Champions. I don't find it moving. For me, the album doesn't really get anywhere. The fourth side could have been fantastic, but the lyrics don't make it go anywhere, whereas with Supper's Ready you really went somewhere. It had a great shape, something this album doesn't have. My feeling about this record is that it had lots of great individual bits, but as a whole it doesn't really work. Maybe because Peter wrote about 99% of the lyrics, it ended up being a bit one-dimensional. We all wrote lyrics and some of us wrote maybe more romantically or poetically, and the contrast was quite nice. Hackett, the album had a strange atmosphere. We were an English band singing about a Puerto Rican punk living in New York. You could even say that it was the start of punk. Even though punk bands savaged us as being part of the establishment, quite frankly I think we gave them a leg up. Banks, writing 2 songs because the plot needed it. The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging and Carpet Crawlers was an interesting exercise, and I think they are 2 of the better songs on the album. They were written very quickly and without any real effort. It taught us that we could write quite spontaneously if we wanted to, and perhaps we should do more of that, because up to this point our music had been pretty structured and complicated, particularly on Selling England by the Pound. Collins, it wasn't an album to please the record company, we did what we wanted. That was what was wonderful about Tony Stratton Smith, he would just try to deal with whatever we gave him. Atlantic always did their best like that too, because Ahmet Ertegun, president of the American record label, was a big music person. He probably didn't understand anything about the Lamb at all, but he could see that it was something adventurous and he just crossed his fingers and hoped that we weren't mad. I went to see the musical box, a French-Canadian Genesis tribute band famous for replicating the band's live shows, play this in its entirety, and I was amazed at just how complicated it is. Banks, I think the first 2 sides work the most, the music seems slightly better. There are a number of tracks I like later on, but I lose interest in the story. I'll listen to it all, but I don't like the shape of the album. For example, it isn't a great ending for an album. It's a good piece, but I think we could have done something slightly more epic, but it was all a bit rushed. We'd had problems obviously, with Peter going off in the middle of the album, and I think some of the spirit had gone out of both the record and the band at that point. Hackett, I suppose I'm not really the one to ask about the Lamb because I'm full of criticism for it. A lot of the time I was trying very hard to get my guitar through the mix, through the very dense keyboard textures, and I was always trying to do something sympathetic in the background. Collins, the mobile studio in Wales was more like being in a rehearsal room, but I still think the Lamb sounds good. Some of those tracks sound a bit like the barn recordings of Neil Young with Crazy Horse. I think some of the best things we've ever done are on that record, the stuff where we just improvised, like The Waiting Room, Silent Sorrow in Empty Boats, Riding the Scree and In the Rapids. Because it was a double album we had space. We had lots of improvised bits, and I think that's something we've never done since. I like The Light Dies Down on Broadway as well. I think that's a great reprise. But there's loads of good stuff on the album: Carpet Crawlers, Counting Out Time, The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging, Back in New York City, The Chamber of 32 Doors. Banks, we had too much material and some of the stuff we'd recorded in the mobile studio was a bit rough. We did a lot of the vocals at Island Studios while the lyrics were still being written. The whole thing was a nightmare. From a point of view of sheer happiness, the whole period of making the album was the lowest ebb in my whole career, it really was. And I didn't enjoy the tour at all. Rutherford, we took a mobile studio up to this crumbling house in Wales. John Burns was the engineer. We recorded it in this room, and I think that gave it more of a live feel, particularly with the drums. I think there's a good sound on this album. Also because the mics were set up more like they were when we were playing together on stage. Collins, I felt it was our first really good sounding record. Everyone looks back at it with a lot of reverence, but they didn't like it at the time. It's looked upon now in the same way that James Dean is. He only made 3 films, but everyone thinks he's a wonderful actor. Banks, for some people, it is a peak. I suppose the fact that it's a double concept album makes it sort of distinct, but at the time it didn't go down well with the fans. It was the only album we made that didn't do as well as its predecessor, in this case Selling England by the Pound. I think it's quite a difficult album, very dark and quite dense. It takes a bit more getting into, and maybe that's why it continues to work really well for the people who like it. That's the thing about Genesis, we don't have any one album that everybody thinks is the album. For example, Pink Floyd have The Dark Side of the Moon, but, with us, every album has been mentioned to me as being the album, apart from perhaps From Genesis to Revelation. Sometimes the reason why an album has a significant impact depends on the point in your life when you heard it. Hackett, I would say Selling England was more our dark side perhaps. Now I can listen to it without any rancor, I don't remember the pain, I can just enjoy it as a piece of music. It was a clever album with lots of great keyboard work but not so many opportunities for the guitar to shine, although where it does it's interesting. I tend to think that it parallels Yes doing their double concept album Tales from Topographic Oceans. I know that often the guys have felt that maybe it would have made a great single album if we just kept the best stuff, but what would we have kept and what would we have thrown away? Banks, although the lyrics are good, no song really stands out on its own. Take the Lamia for example, if you sing that out of context it makes no sense at all, being as it's about snakes and stuff, and I slightly resent that aspect of it. There are two songs we used to perform quite often, In the Cage, which almost works, although lyrically the Brother John bit in the middle doesn't make much sense, but it's a very strong piece of music, and Carpet Crawlers, which works because it's got a chorus. The Waiting Room Live in Berkeley, January 22, 1975. The ghostly shape of Gabriel was projected behind the screens. That could relate to anything. The verse lyrics are pretty strange, but there's some lovely imagery in there. Looking back, it wasn't the best time of my life and it was a difficult album to make. I think it's got lots of great moments on it. As a double album, its real weakness is the fourth side. Unlike today's CDs, where you put all the strong stuff up at the front, the idea back then was to build up to a big ending, and I don't think this does. Hackett, some members of the band were trying to be romantic while others wanted to be more realistic, more cynical. Pete felt that he was trying to drag the band into the 80s. It was the start of punk rock and probably, in some ways, the death of the band's progressive rock period, although we did go on to do more of that as a four-piece. I think something was lost, dead and buried with Selling England by the Pound, and The Lamb marked a start of a new era for the band. It's not an album I feel that close to. There are some good moments in it, but it wasn't a happy time, so it wasn't a happy album. Anyone who feels it's their favorite album is coming at it from an entirely different perspective. Getting the album made was a victory of sorts, a Pyrrhic victory. Ultimately we lost our singer and something of the spirit of the band was lost at that point, although we did perhaps recover some of that later on. It depends whether you think that The Lamb or The Wall are the apices of Genesis and Pink Floyd's achievements. You've got to look at the whole of the band's history to understand what works and what nearly works. Gabriel, it felt as if we were still living that dream of isolating ourselves and supposedly being in a nurturing, creative environment. Even though that wasn't working on lots of different levels, I still think some of our best material of that period went into The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and looking back it's still one of the things I feel proud of. Quite often there's this irony in life, when really shitty things are going on, the creativity that comes out of it can still be strong, interesting, and move people. Musically there was a confidence and an assurance about what we were doing as writers and players. I think it's a good record. Banks, of all the albums we made, this is the one I enjoyed making the least. I got very little pleasure out of it. A lot of it was quite a fight. I mean, I like everything we've done, but, coming back to it, Foxtrot and Selling England by the Pound are by far the best two albums from this period. And I prefer a lot of the later albums to this one, such as Duke and Wind and Wuthering. I like The Lamb because it's adventurous. We tried a lot of things, some of which worked. Having a better story would have helped a lot. It was a strange period in terms of commercial success. It didn't do as well as Selling England by the Pound, which was slightly weird. It didn't open up new territory for us, and the tour didn't go down that well either. We had built up a really good following up to and including Selling England by the Pound. We had grown to a certain stature, and then I felt we lost it a little bit on this whole project, although we were able to rebuild it with a trick of the tail. That was great for us and the fans. They were very happy with the trick of the tail. It was more like Selling England by the Pound. Of course, Pete went off and did something completely different himself. In some ways he became much more user-friendly. So it was a fraught time and a slightly fraught album. But it's unique and I'm very proud of it. An album, which as can quite clearly be seen was not appreciated in equal measure by everyone in the band. The Lamb appears to be revitalized in the new 5.1 remixes by Nick Davis, released in 2008. Rutherford, when I heard this a few years ago, when Nick Davis remixed it, I was impressed by much energy the album and the band as players actually had. The opening track and Back in New York City are really quite heavy songs. It's funny because people now regard the album as a great moment, probably because we gave ourselves space to do different stuff, but at the time it was a bit of a flop. Gabriel, I think Nick worked very hard and did a good job of remixing The Lamb, but at some point I wouldn't mind having a go myself. I think it's interesting to hear different interpretations of records. For example, with the Beatles, I would have loved to have heard the different band members' interpretations of their albums. Rutherford, Nick did a great job with the remixes and Tony was there much of the time, so the early albums have definitely improved a lot. At the time they weren't recorded that well and they were mixed quickly. The Lamb is the album that was always pretty good actually. Hackett, the remixes that I've heard sound very good, but I think they could have been just that little bit better, they could have been a little more creative. But try working with a corporation these days, it's very hard to get a consensus when no one is working face to face anymore and you are sending each other stuff and waiting for a reply. I think the new mixes sound very considered and I like what I've heard of The Lamb very much. There are guitar parts that I originally put down that were either left out or buried in the mix, so it's great to hear them now. The concerts. After increasing the theatrical content of their live performances, thanks to the ever more histrionic showmanship of frontman Gabriel, who by Selling England by the Pound had perfected and extended the costumes and stage show scene in the tour to promote Foxtrot, the band was going to have to come up with something exceptional to present their double concept album. The band with Gabriel at the fore, intended to put on a real musical type show to help the audience get into the anything but simple world of rail. With this in mind, a more intimate stage setup was planned. The four instrumentalists were each placed on an individual platform and the lights were less invasive to create a darker scene full of black and white contrast and a focus on the rich array of slides, over 1,000. These images were projected on 3 screens to capture the attention of the audience who were already captivated by the now truly extravagant personality of the lead singer. Collins, I just have very vivid memories of record company executives coming in and heading straight for Pete. It didn't bother me that nobody said Phil, you're great, it was the fact that the music was very rarely mentioned, and I was starting to feel that the music was being overshadowed by the visuals, which were getting a little bit out of hand. I mean, the idea of having these screens behind us was fantastic but they never worked. I think there were maybe 4 shows in 100 when everything actually changed at the right moment. With the help of a carefully selected staff of well-known professionals, the original tour program lists: Alan Owen, lights; David Lawrence, projections; Jane Highfield, costume design; Peter Hart, special effects. Genesis got ready to take their latest creation out into the world. The band had planned a dozen or so concerts in England for the end of October, aiming to set foot on American soil by November 20th. However, the high level of tension simmering within the band led to an accident involving Steve Hackett. Just a few days before the tour was about to start, the guitarist, already under strain due to the breakdown of his marriage, was at a backstage party of the sensational Alex Harvey Band when he heard someone say, "The band is good, but they'd be nothing without Alex Harvey." Obviously projecting the Harvey comment onto the situation with Gabriel and Genesis, and with his nerves already at breaking point, Steve crushed the wine glass he was holding and severed a tendon and nerve in his thumb. Given that the injured guitarist would obviously be unable to play for a number of weeks, the first UK dates in October, 29 to 30 in Newcastle, and November, 1 to 2 in Manchester, 4 in London, 6 to 7 in Edinburgh, 8 to 9 in Bristol, 11 to 12 in Birmingham, had to be cancelled. They were then rescheduled for April to May 1975. And so it was that the tour started in the Auditorium Theatre, Chicago, on November 20th. At that time The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway had yet to be released in the US, making their first concerts on American soil more than just a little bizarre. Rutherford, we took it live and played America before the album was out. A whole show of a new double concept album. Thinking about it, it was madness really, but actually it went down okay. That was a long tour and I got a bit tired of playing it. I remember towards the end thinking I would never do that again, you know, where you just play one era of music. It's nice to mix up different eras, different songs, different styles. In fact, Genesis, faithful to the theatrical aspect of the double album, decided to play it in its entirety, with a long 90-minute performance interrupted only by Gabriel's brief introductions before each of the first three sides. The only concession made to their faithful fans was the encore, usually the musical box, although in around Onet heard of the concerts, Genesis would perform a second encore with Watcher of the Skies. Collins, we went over to America and played the album for the first time, and nobody had heard a note of it. 4 sides of this new music they'd never heard with just a couple of old songs at the end. That was very brave and we had a great time doing it. Lots of good music. Banks, the audience didn't know the album, half the time they wanted to hear The Knife and Supper's Ready. Half the songs never worked live. And I couldn't play them right because I had the wrong piano. Execution of the songs from the album did, in fact, present a few problems and timing issues. The lack of a proper piano was most noticeable in Anyway, played much more slowly than on the album, even though the song was, as Banks says, pretty easy to play. I mean, there have been a few things over the years that have been bastards to play, but not this one. Apart from Banks' issues, the biggest problem was Gabriel due to the high pitch of some of the songs, but it didn't end there. Banks, back in New York City, was a nightmare for Pete to sing live. A lot of the time when playing The Lamb live, the vocals were compromised because he was wearing masks, and with the Slipper Man he never got the mic anywhere near his mouth, so we were always let down by the vocals. When we came to release the live version 1998, in the Genesis Archive 1967-75 box set, a lot of the vocals weren't usable and needed redoing. If truth be told, the only mask Gabriel actually wore during this tour was the Slipper Man costume, an incredible series of different-sized round lumps covering the singer's entire body down to his legs to represent the disgusting warts Rael was left with from having dared to yield to the pleasures of the flesh. Collins, the worst thing was the slipper man where he came out dressed in this horrible outfit with inflatable genitals. Sometimes he got a little bit stuck on the way out, and other times, when he did make it out, the microphone could barely get near his mouth, and when it did he was out of breath. There are a lot of words in that song and he was running around. I think the slipper man costume was something very last minute to avoid confrontations. It was funny and it was adventurous, it was edgy and it was like nobody else. But I didn't think it was very musical. Gabriel, it was the chance of having interesting looking visuals that would get a reaction from people. The slipper man costume was a really ugly looking thing, and as Phil quite rightly said, it was bloody hard to sing inside there as we didn't have those little tiny mics back then. So inside this mask, I was trying to hold the microphone and was tripping up over things, and I'd crawl under Tony's organ. It was just trying to explore things and push it a lot and have fun. But again, it was like with the lyrics, I knew that if everything went to the vote it would die a horrible death. For the visuals and screen projections I worked a lot with Jeffrey Shaw, who I think now runs an interactive arts center in Germany. He was a good ally to have, and there weren't any real problems or bad English once the others felt good that there was something interesting and of quality coming. For the rest of the show, Gabriel put a great deal of energy and mobility into presenting the main character, Rael, portraying the young Puerto Rican dressed in a leather jacket over a white t-shirt and jeans. During the show Peter also sang 2 songs bare-chested, Cuckoo Cocoon, during which he also played the flute lying down on one side in front of Banks' keyboards, and in the cage, whereas during the instrumental The Waiting Room his shadow appeared behind the central screen dressed in a hat and long-fingered gloves to represent evil. Another key theatrical moment was during the Lamia, dressed all in white, Peter sang from underneath a silk cone on which the female serpent figures were depicted, and this would turn around him during the choruses. Collins, we were all pleased Peter was back, but the situation was such that when he decided he was really going to leave we were kind of expected. Peter told Tony Smith that he was leaving when we were in Cleveland. I remember sitting in a room with Tony Smith talking about what we were going to do next. It was a bit strange to be carrying on doing gigs knowing the singer was leaving. Hackett, I remember talking to Peter on a plane one day. I asked him if he was seriously going to leave. And he said, yeah, afraid so, I've made up my mind. To start with I thought it was all part of the act, part of the show, and, like the makeup, it was going to come off, but no, it was real. He had family pressures and I think that he wanted to be an active parent. At that point, it looked as if he wanted to pull out of the music business altogether and do something else, but in the end he went on from strength to strength, and so did the band. But it was very, very tough trying to come to terms with the fact that the star was going to leave. Banks, Peter and I started off in the group as best friends, but by then it was getting more difficult, particularly within the group, so it was a sad time. We did about 100 shows of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which wasn't a fantastic show to be honest. We were trying to do the whole album to audiences who really wanted to hear a lot of the old hits. There were 1 or 2 nights when it was great, when everything seemed to work and it sounded really good, but it wasn't so pleasurable. And in the middle of the tour Pete said he was going to leave for good, so it was a strange period for us. Rutherford, when Peter finally broke the news he was leaving, it wasn't such a huge shock because we'd already had a pre-warning. We'd just managed to persuade Tony Smith to leave his business and become our manager, poor guy, and suddenly the singer leaves? I'm sure he thought, oh God, what have I done? We're talking about what seemed like a long period, but it was only 5 years actually. I remember once seeing the list of gigs we did in 1 year and it was like 210. In 1 year. That's a lot of gigs. I always feel uncomfortable if someone I'm working with wants to be somewhere else. You feel you're putting your heart and soul into it and they're not really in the same space. So, in a sense, if somebody does want to leave, I've always felt it's the right thing to do. I'm sure Peter thought, what comes next? I've written virtually all the lyrics for a double concept album, can I go back to where I was before? But I think it would have been hard to go backwards again. With sadness in their hearts and turmoil in their minds, Genesis tackled the first leg of the US tour, 25 gigs in 1 month with only 4 days off. They started out from the interior states of Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana before heading to the East Coast, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and then New York with 2 consecutive concerts at the Academy of Music, 6 to 7 December. At this point, Genesis were appearing in medium-sized theaters and auditoriums. Towards the end of the tour the band also set foot in neighboring Canada, with a concert in Montreal and one in Toronto, before returning to the state of New York for the last 2 dates on 17 and December 18. 2 weeks off and the band were back in the US for the second leg of the tour, again for almost another month, January 10 to February 4. This time the focus was on the southern states. They started out in Florida, West Palm Beach and Lakeland, and then moved progressively westwards, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, all the way to California, where they played in Berkeley, January 22, and San Diego, on the 25th, with the famous concert at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles in between, on the 24th. The live recording of this show would be released 23 years later in the Genesis Archive 1967-75 box set, featuring newly recorded vocals and guitar parts. Collins, the live show recorded at the Shrine Auditorium is probably the best version of the album, even though the studio album captured something different about us. But when we started playing it live, we were fantastic. After the happy parenthesis in California, the band went back towards the center of the US, stopping off in Arizona on the 28th and replacing the original concert scheduled for February 1 at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre in Vancouver, Canada, simply too far away, for a geographically more feasible venue in Kansas City. The American tour came to an end with 3 concerts in Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. After a 2-week break, Genesis finally got to tackle Europe. The tour started in Oslo, Norway, on February 19, and then went on to Denmark, Germany and Holland. On the 26th the band arrived in France, a country which was very supportive of Genesis in this particular era, where they played 5 concerts up to March 3. They then went on to play 2 consecutive evenings in Cascais, Portugal, 6 to 7 March, something which was of great symbolic value as the country had just entered the Third Republic following the Carnation Revolution, less than a year earlier. According to the European tour program, after 3 shows in Spain, Genesis were supposed to play 10 or so concerts in Italy, from 14 to March 24. However, due to the political tensions in Italy at that time and the months of clashes instigated by the auto-reduction movement, the Italian tour was all but cancelled, with the exception of a single date at the Turin Palasport on March 24 where the band played to an audience of around 12,000, exceeding the official venue capacity, but not without the by then usual audience skirmishes with the police and between fringe extremists. A couple of the dates originally planned for Italy were offset by concerts in France and the long German tour with 11 dates, March 26 to April 8, incorporated a detour into Switzerland, Bern, and was followed by 3 concerts in the Netherlands, 10 to 12 April. Unable to change the layout of the concept album, the band, by now showing clear signs of fatigue, started to unleash a bit of tension by making variations to the encores, after having only played Watcher of the Skies on 3 occasions, Paris, Badalona, Annecy. Genesis added the knife for the first time in Brussels, April 12, to the musical box, something which would also occur occasionally on later dates, with them playing the knife as their only encore in Liverpool on April 19. Halfway through April the band finally got to play the tour dates which had been cancelled the previous October, 16 almost consecutive concerts, with just 3 days off, from April 14, at the Empire Pool in Wembley with a repeat show on the following day, to May 2 with a second concert at the Birmingham Hippodrome. In between there were shows in Southampton, Liverpool, 3 evenings on the trot, Edinburgh, 2 shows, Newcastle, 2, and Manchester, 2. After a couple of days off, Genesis were getting ready for the final push, with another show in Belgium and 5 in Germany before the grand finale in France, with a quick detour to Spain, San Sebastian, May 18. The last gigs on French soil were chaotic. For many years it was written that the last show was played at Saint-Étienne, but that's not quite how it went. The last date was supposed to be on May 24, 1975 at Parc des Expositions in Toulouse, but this was cancelled due to poor ticket sales. And so the curtain fell on the Peter Gabriel era in a town of 120,000 inhabitants called Besançon, on May 22. Collins, the last gig, which was supposed to be Toulouse, was cancelled, so what actually became our last show was a bit of an anticlimax because there'd been no kind of build-up to it. What's incredible is that we all disagree on where the last show was. I'm convinced we ended the tour in Besançon even if everybody else tells me we ended it in Saint-Étienne. Hackett, Besançon sounds familiar to me. But there was a cancelled show, the very last one. So it was a bit of an anticlimax because we were expecting to do one more show, so nobody realized that that was going to be Pete's last show with the band. So there was a feeling of great sadness at the end and also great relief because we were all exhausted, physically and emotionally. Banks, in the middle of the tour Pete said that he was leaving and we had to carry on playing this thing and we cancelled the last show of the tour in Europe because there was no audience. We just petered out. There were some good shows in the middle of the tour but the last few were very damp. We were supposed to be doing the last show in Toulouse, but we went just forget it and so we finished a day early in Besançon. There weren't many people coming and we thought, we can't face this anymore, just forget it. But while the band were going through their interior torment, some of the crew thought it would be a good time for a joke. As Banks recalls, in the final show instead of the dummy, one of the roadies got up on stage, naked, so instead of a double Peter, you had Peter and a naked roadie with the strobes flashing at the high point of the whole piece. I turned round and it was my roadie, Jeff. It wasn't pleasant. In August 1975, with a letter handed over to the UK press, Peter Gabriel made his divorce from Genesis official. Gabriel, I think it was great that we went out on a good piece of work. As with any sort of divorce there were difficulties, but there was never really any bad feelings with the individuals. Most of what they wanted I was prepared to give them, including extra touring time, my tape archive and most of the equipment and stuff. They were much more successful without me so there was actually no real issue, but I think everyone had doubts and were very frustrated because we had worked a long time to get some success. We were about to get some financial rewards. So then this bastard goes and sabotages the whole thing just as it gets successful. That wasn't a popular thing to do from a career point of view. Compared to some other band breakups, where there was a lot more acrimony than in our case, I think we handled it in a fairly sort of adult way. Collins, On and off throughout the years there have been rumors that I was either the instigator of Peter's leaving because of my apparent unhappiness at Pete's visuals or pleased that he left so that I could sing. None of that is true. I love Peter to this day. I've played on his albums. I played for him as his drummer for free at one point, when he was promoting his third album, because he couldn't afford a band. You know, I went to his wedding. He came to mine. I was very sad when he left, but we had to get on with it. And I didn't want to be the singer at all because I was the drummer and, by that point, I was a very good drummer. I ended up singing because we couldn't find anybody else. Gabriel, some people think Phil was chomping at the bit waiting to get rid of me, but it wasn't like that at all. He loved being a drummer and, although he was beginning to write songs and sing, the band didn't consider him the singer, and I don't think he really considered himself as the singer for Genesis. It was clear to me that he could have a big career on his own, and I remember saying that to him because we would often be hammering out our own things, which were sounding quite different from what the band was doing. I never had the feeling that the band wanted to get rid of me at any time. For a while the singer disappeared from the scene completely. Gabriel, I never had regrets about leaving the band, although I had some fears about working with other musicians again and trying to forge my own way, because I wanted out of the business for a couple of years. I couldn't imagine getting rid of the poison we'd accumulated in any other way. There was suddenly the sense of freedom and being able to collaborate with all sorts of wonderful musicians from all over the world and yet be able to sit in the captain's chair. When I don't like things I can stop or do them again or even throw them away. Deprived of their frontman, after asking themselves about the future, the remaining band members decided to roll up their sleeves and carry on, promoting Phil Collins to lead singer. While his ex-bandmates headed down the road towards worldwide stardom, Gabriel was in no rush to make his return, but when he did he became one of the most influential artists of his generation. Gabriel, many people have been puzzled by how we did so well and how the hell we survived for so long when in a lot of critics' eyes the music is unlistenable. I actually think it's because our music is based on songwriters and obviously we built a very strong fan base by playing live. If you look at, say, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young or other bands which are songwriter-based rather than musician-based, you do see long lifespans. Maybe not all are in the same direction, but it's a different sensibility. Most bands begin by playing together and then find writing, whereas we wanted to write and we found playing. Notes. 1. Mike Kaufman's Genesis Interviews, Chicago, London, October 2007, partially used in the bonus disc accompanying the 2008 remasters. 2. Mario Giametti listens to The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway with Tony Banks, Chiddingfold, May 10, 2011. 3. Personal email sent to Mario Giametti by Steve Hackett, dated April 27, 2012. 4. Mario Giametti's telephone interview with Steve Hackett, February 7, 2012, partially published in the article I Colori della Chitarra in Dusk, issue number 58, March 2008.
Genesis
1967 to 1975, The Peter Gabriel Years.
The definitive biography of the early years of one of the world's greatest progressive rock bands.
The book features numerous exclusive interviews with band members and with all of the important personalities who were part of the story of Genesis between 1967 and 1975.
Alongside detailed information on live tours and a comprehensive gig guide, the book includes revelatory interviews which were carried out with individual members of Genesis during listen-throughs of each of the band's first 6 albums.
A must for all fans who are interested in early Genesis. I thoroughly recommend it. Steve Hackett.
Essential for anyone with more than a passing interest in the band. Prog Magazine. As a longtime Genesis fan who is familiar with their story, I really enjoyed this well-written and informative history of their important early years. Mark Kelly, Marillion.
Prepared and edited by
Grzegorz Grabowski.